Well, we were a little slim on Wednesday, so we suspended our usual study on Wednesday so that we didn't have as many that would be behind or missing out. So, chapter 10 is what we're going to look at this evening.
Yeah.
So, all right, now, first part of chapter 10, as Merrill likes to call it, is the Toledo T. You'll recall the theological term is a Toledot, but everybody generally calls it a genealogy. And yes, it's a little dry at the first part here, so I'm not going to sit and read verbatim every single thing in here because, well, it is a little, this guy begat that guy who begat that guy. But anyway, chapter 10, beginning in verse 1 says, "Now these are the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and sons were born to them after the flood." Now, how do we know, other than just this passage, that there were no kids that they had before the flood? Yeah, because the Bible makes it very clear there was only 8 of them. So we know they didn't have any before the flood, but they apparently had kids after the flood. Now, there's some question in here as to which one of these two were the oldest, Shem or Japheth. Now, I think in all probability, Japheth was the older one. He's the oldest of the 3. And I will tell you why in just a minute there's even any question as that when we get down to that passage of Scripture. But item number 1 as to why he's probably the oldest is in our listing of genealogies. Notice who comes first. Japheth does. It says the sons of Japheth was, and by the way, again, that's not Gomer, it's Gomer, Magog and Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. Now, notice a lot of these names are very familiar. We find in Revelation and in Ezekiel where it talks about in the Battle of Armageddon that it's Gog and Magog and, Beth Togarmah. All of these are, descendants of Japheth. Well, without, again, itemizing every single one of them, just drop down to verse 5. It says, "From these the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, every one according to his language, according to their families, into their nations." Now, let me point one thing out before we start looking at where these people went to. Notice it said they were separated into their languages. But then we find in the last part of chapter 10 and into chapter 11, it says that they were all gathered at the Tower of Babel, and the Bible makes it very clear in the latter part of this chapter that there was only one language. So how is it now we have saying that they were separated according to their languages?
But it isn't chronological.
That's the big issue got to keep in mind. I point that out because sometimes it never fails that somebody will look at this and say, wait a minute. When we get to the Tower of Babel, it says they only had one language. You say, well, we already studied where it says they were separated by their languages. Because at this point, as Moses is recording all this, as it has been related to him, as Merrill just mentioned, not all of this is chronological. As we describe these families descending from Noah, we have jumped way forward several generations. And so the language barriers don't come yet. But now, the families of Japheth, also notice that there's not really that many that have been named so far. but we're only talking about Japheth's sons. And if you want to go through, I didn't read every single one of them, but if you want to go through and count every one of them up, there's, I believe, 14 of them. Japheth had the greatest number of kids, which if you go back to Noah's blessing on his kids, who did he bless and say would be the most numerous? Yeah, he'd even said that Japheth would be the one with the most numerous ones. Now, again, fast forwarding, and my little scribbled map here, which I'm not an artist, didn't claim to be one, but I did add Sardinia just for your benefit.
Thank you.
A little spot right here.
Corsica's still missing a
Now,
little dot on top of Sardinia.
I could see Corsica from my front room.
Oh my gosh. Buy him a map.
and I've even got Sicily and Crete down here now.
Malta's another little dot missing.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to go there. Yeah, well, if you want to put down Greece, you know, there'd be about 1,000
there
little
you
dots
go.
all
There
over.
you go. Yeah, you're missing Cyprus still too. Sorry.
All right. Anyway, point being, when they got off the ark, now I know there's still plenty of theologians out there that would argue with me over this, that would say, oh no, the land was divided during the flood and that's what caused the flood. I'm not going to get too deep into it right now, but of those that are of the mind that the land divided during or as, you know, going into the flood, they miss out on one very important detail that they cannot and will not answer. How'd all the animals, if they all got off the ark in one spot, if the continents had already divided, then how in the world did animals get scattered all over the world, including even islands that are 1,000 miles from anywhere? We know, now I know they'll say, well, God just put them there. But how many times have we already seen that God brought all of these things to bear using natural means to do it? Just like the flood. God could have just said, let there be a flood, and boom, it would have been there. But he chose not to. He used natural means to do it. When the flood receded, again, God could have said, let the dry land appear again. But he didn't. He allowed it to happen naturally. So why, and all of these things as God is allowing to happen naturally, I mean, not to say that God isn't directing the process, but he's allowing it to happen naturally, why then would he pick that one thing and say, oh, well, you know, let's, you know, move these animals over? The animals, people, maybe, but it would have been physically impossible for the animal kingdom to have repopulated the earth if the earth had already been divided. So, now, that
Plus
brings you to
the
this.
Bible tells us that the land was divided into.
I'll explain their objection
Later.
to that in a minute.
Okay.
I'll explain that one shortly here. So, now, in my little map here, which is, again, I'm not a good artist, but I think you can kind of figure out where things are. Keep in mind, this is after, obviously, the land had already been divided. But after they were divided, in general, by the direction that Noah's kids and their families fanned out, the families of Japheth, they all populated basically from Asia Minor all up in here. I'll kind of do my little hash marks. That would kind of tell you that's pretty much where the families of Japheth moved to. They all went north up into what became Europe, Asia Minor, all of that. That's why in our study in Revelation and talking about the Battle of Armageddon and what have you, when the armies of the north are coming southward into Israel, he lists all of the families of Japheth, Gog and Magog and Beth Togarmah and all these. Why? Because they're the ones that all moved up north. So all they're coming southward. All right, now Now also notice in verse 5 it says they were separated in their lands, everyone according to their language. Let's see, where was it? Blah, 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 blah. Okay, that wasn't. Oh yeah, the first part of verse 5 it says, from these the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands. Probably because you see here, you got a lot of coastland involved in there, but more than likely that is probably a reference to where they were prior to the time that the land divided. Because if there was one giant continent, Japheth's sons tended to go toward where the coast were at that time. All right, then beginning in verse 6, said the sons of Ham. Now, if we know Ham is the youngest, and by the way, how do we know that? Because it tells us earlier, I believe it was in chapter 9, that, is it 9, 12, or somewhere in there? There's somewhere in chapter 9, what's that?
24.
Okay, yeah.
Youngest son of Japheth.
Verse 24, it says, when Noah woke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done. So we know from that, even though Ham may be listed second in this, we know for a fact Ham is indeed the youngest.
Is Shem listed last here because he's most important?
That is the reason Shem is last. Because we've got a summary of Japheth and Ham's families, and then a considerable amount more time is spent on Shem, because Shem is, he establishes the family line of promise. And it's interesting to me that, and I've told you this before, but just as a reminder, the name Shem literally means name. Noah named his son name. Don't ask me why, but I find that prophetic in that if he is the ancestor of Jesus, all throughout the Bible it refers to having faith in what?
The name.
The
of
name.
Jesus.
Having faith in the name. It's all about the name. And Jesus descended from the name.
God just doesn't do anything willy-nilly.
No, it's all for a reason.
Maybe Noah couldn't remember him or his name. So it's like you call your dog dog.
Thanks, Larry. All right. The sons of Ham, Cush and Mizraim. By the way, Mizraim, that's what Egypt used to be called, like thousands of years ago. When it was first settled, before it became Egypt, Egypt was Mizraim.
Cush is Ethiopia, right?
It is. Put is an ancient name for Libya. So what you have here is the sons of Ham. They occupied, and here we're going to do little X's, all of this area across North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Ham settled all of that, and we can assume, even though it doesn't list these, if Ham's descendants have all come here, common sense tells us that in most cases, as time went by, they would have probably moved into southern Africa, and probably also are the ancestors of those that lived down here. But here you have Ham everywhere from Canaan, Arabian Peninsula, all of North Africa. So there's Ham. By the way, now there are those who usually try to claim that, well, Ham is the forefather of all of the dark-skinned people because, well, of the curse. Well, there's two problems with that. First off, Ham was never cursed.
His kids.
Yeah. I don't know how many times I've read commentaries that talk about the curse of Ham. Ham didn't get cursed. God blessed Ham. It was Canaan that got cursed.
And the Canaanites are not black.
And the Canaanites are not black. Which proves to us, first off, that having dark skin is not a curse. That is bad theology. In fact, it's lying theology is what it is. Ham did not have a curse upon him. It was Canaan. And even then, it's Noah that did it. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, while God may bless and curse, does a human being have the spiritual authority to pronounce a curse upon somebody that God somehow honors simply because Noah got mad at the time? There's no indication that simply because Noah was mad at Ham and cursed his youngest son, that somehow God said, "Oh, I got to curse him now because Noah said this." Yeah, I don't think so.
So where did the black race come
Well,
from? And I mean, where did all the different colored skin people come from?
well, you got to look at it from there's two things in play here. Number one,
No one's ever explained, I've never heard the explanations.
well, how much time we got?
Portia.
All right. Well, I'll throw this out there now. Then,
Okay.
that may be as far as we get. There's two things at play. First of all, it is highly probable, although we can't prove it, but highly probable that when Adam and Eve were created, they were probably created with a medium toned skin, what we would today consider, olive skin. Also keep in mind, there is no such thing as black or white skin or whatever. Frankly, every single one of us, I don't care how dark your skin is, we're all basically the same color. The only question is how much of what's called melanin, which is the coloring in your skin, how much of it you've got. It's not that we're white and black, it's really that we're light and dark. The only thing that difference, now granted I realize there are facial and some characteristics like that might change. For example, the fact that a lot of black people tend to have a broader nose or things of that sort, but those are just facial characteristics. But as far as the skin, the only difference between a black man's skin and ours is they've got more melanin in their skin than we do. But the color is the same. Now, why did they get that way? Reason number one, I just mentioned it, with Adam and Eve, if God created them, the color that most scientists tend to think, God would have created them, excuse me, with the genetic predisposition to have kids that might go in any direction. For example, Meryl here has got, how many cats you got now? 14?
12.
12, okay. 12 different cats. And of course, we know Meryl listens to The Price is Right and gets all his cats spayed and neutered. But if those cats, some of them black, some white, some cream colored, some this, some that, if they were to interbreed, you're going to have, 20, 30, 40 different color combinations that are going to result from that. If Adam and Eve were created with the genetics in their DNA to produce kids that might have a variety, just plain ordinary human genetics would take effect, and over the course of several generations, you might have some kids that are a little darker complexion, some that are lighter complexions. I mean, for example, my brother and I, we share the same parents, but yet I've got a slightly darker complexion than he is. Not strong, but I've got a slightly darker complexion than he does. Well, being as the people that we are, if we have a dark complexion, what do we naturally tend to do when we're seeking a mate? We're going to find somebody that looks sort of like us. And so God has put it within us from the beginning to seek out those that generally look like us. And you put two dark-skinned people together, more than likely you're going to have more dark-skinned kids. So you've got a genetic issue there. Second thing is, and I hate to use this term because evolutionists like to use it, but it's not really evolution, it's just plain common sense. What the evolutionists unfortunately calls it natural selection. If you're in an area that, well, like equatorial Africa, where the sun is at its highest, people with dark skin, well, the more melanin you have in your skin, the more ultraviolet radiation that your skin will filter out. So people who have light skin are more susceptible to getting cancer and dying at an early age in areas where the sun is stronger. And notice where people that have exceptionally light skin, where do they tend to live? The upper latitudes where the sun does not beat down on the earth directly. The sun is always lower in the sky, say in Scandinavia. So you've got that process going on. But the bottom line is it's just plain human genetics that we tend to diverge over the course of multiple generations.
Then you got not Middle Eastern, but the Oriental is completely. I mean, you can tell Oriental people are completely facial differences from the African race and the European race. Their facial differences are completely different. Also. Not just the skin tone.
Well, now here's the other issue, and here's why I really didn't want to get too deep into this at the time, because I was saving this for our study of the Tower of Babel.
Okay.
But let me just throw this one thing out there. If God confounded the languages at the Tower of Babel, and we don't know this for sure, this is a question.
Okay.
Is it possible that God may have also miraculously changed our facial characteristics, or our, some characteristics of our skin? Because I looked it up just the other day. The estimated world population at the Tower of Babel would have been somewhere around 30 to 40,000 people. There would have been that many generations by then. Now, in a crowd of 40,000 people, if you wake up one morning and suddenly the guy that's working next to you at the tower, you can't understand him anymore. And you're looking around realizing that, man, something miraculous has happened. We don't speak the same anymore. And you're in a crowd of 40,000 people who are all gathered there trying to build this great tower. Are you going to go around one by one trying to figure out who speaks like you? Or would you be able to easier look around and say, oh man, I woke up and it seems like over the last several days, my skin has began to darken, or my face has began to change a little bit. And as you look around, it's like, well, that guy looks like me. His skin's beginning to darken too. Let me go talk to him and see if he can, and you go talk to him and realize that he's one of your close family members that you can understand him. And God, because let's face it, if God confounded the languages to force us apart, it does in fact tell us here later in our study of the rest of chapter 10 that God divided them up by their family groups, that it's possible that as they sought each other out, that those particular family groups may also have begun to take on certain physical characteristics that would have helped them to identify who was who, and they would have then began to move off, and any changes that God might have brought about in their DNA or in their appearance, it would have been multiplied with each generation after that, as those families then began to intermarry within that family group rather than mixing up with all of the different races.
And God knew in advance, before he separated the lands, where he would be putting different pieces of land and which peoples would be occupying those lands, and what genetic changes were necessary for them to be able to thrive in the climates and environments where they would be.
Mm-hmm.
And he did the same thing with the animals.
The evolutionists tell us that all these genetic changes happened over millions of years as a result of adaptation to climate, but we know climate changes too often for that to be, you know, able to be the source of those changes.
Oh, yeah.
That's absurd, you know, that whole scenario of, you know, millions of years of adaptation when the climate's changing so much over that period.
And the same thing with animals, Merrill. There's some animals that are only adapted to certain areas in the
And
earth.
God did that.
And like
And let's take
what's
you.
that one island that only animals?
Galapagos, you're talking about, yeah.
Huh? Yeah, yeah.
But you know, using that example, say the animals as, if you've ever seen a snow leopard, snow leopards are adapted for the particular climate that they live in. They're basically leopards, but they have grown exceptionally long fur. In fact, because of their long fur, they can't survive in warm climates. They would overheat. And you put, and we see this in, say, a zoo environment. You take a snow leopard, a regular short-haired leopard, and a cougar and other similar animals, put them in an enclosure together. If they have a choice, they will mate with other animals that look like them.
We have Krugers
But,
here, and
yeah.
they have Krugers or leopards in North America, but they are the same animal, but they're different.
Mountain
Well,
lion,
the
mountain
point-
lion versus
yeah.
puma.
The point that I'm getting at here is if the animal has a choice, they will naturally gravitate toward those that are like them.
Yes.
But if you force those animals where they don't have a choice, but say to breed from one species to the other, like from the snow leopard to a cougar, they will do that, and we find that genetically they are still compatible. But it's their preference not to. And so God has put it within us to, even though that we can intermarry among, you know, different races and what have you, we have a natural tendency to want to gravitate toward those that look and, you know, like us.
Birds of a feather.
Mm-hmm.
The most important thing is that we all have the same blood.
Yep. All right. Anyway, to try to continue on and get at least as far as we can before the next 5 minutes. Verse 6 says, the sons of Ham were Cush and Mizraim, Put and Canaan. The sons of Cush, and it just goes on. Again, I'm not going to just reiterate everything, but verse 8, Cush became the father of Nimrod. Now, by the way, the reason Nimrod is important is Nimrod is the one that is credited with having founded the city of Nineveh. Now, if Nimrod founded Nineveh, that tells us that Ham's ancestors also, and by the way, Assyria, where Nimrod became the capital of, that's up in here. So Ham's descendants made it up into this area. So there was some crossover, you know, up into here. Now, let's see. Verse 9 says, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. By the way, in verse 9 where it says, a mighty hunter before the Lord, that word before can be translated two different ways. It can mean he was a hunter before the Lord, but in some context it also can mean he was a mighty hunter against the Lord. So depending on the context, he might have been either serving God, or it might have meant that he was a mighty hunter in spite of God. All depends on the context. And in view of the fact that he was a descendant of Ham, and that he founded cities in an area that became enemies of the Israelites, I have a feeling probably the more appropriate translation is probably that he was in opposition to God.
I read an interpretation that seemed off base and doesn't seem to be supported by scripture here, that said that all of this interpretation of Nimrod being a person is a misinterpretation, that the Nimrod means rebellion, and that Cush begat rebellion, he didn't begat a son.
Well,
And that Cush was the source of the rebellion and not the person Nimrod. But it goes on to say that Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. So
Well-
that seems to contradict that interpretation.
Well, keep in mind that a lot of their names actually had meanings, and the name Nimrod does in fact mean rebellion, which I think both is true. Is that I believe, based on the context, Nimrod is a man who was, I believe, the grandson of Ham, but that he was probably a rebel, and that he's, refused, like a lot of other Ham's descendants, refused to serve God. And we see that probably learned it from his grandfather. All right, now, drop down to verse 15. It says, and Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgashite, the Hivite, Archite, blah, 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 so on. Now, notice that these are all descendants of people that were occupying Canaan, and notice how many of them are tribal peoples that the Israelites were told to, when you cross over the Jordan River, here's who you're going to encounter, and you need to get rid of them. Every last one of them descendants of Ham. And by the way, we're told that when King David finally was able to defeat the inhabitants of Jerusalem, guess who the inhabitants of Jerusalem were?
Descendants of Ham.
They were the Jebusites. Yep, they were descendants of Ham. Verse 20, these are the sons of Ham according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, by their nations. All right. Now, if you give me about 3 more minutes and we can call this quits, I can kind of summarize the remainder of verse 21 through the rest of this. It says, also to Shem. Notice again, even though Shem is not the youngest, he is listed last because Moses saved the promised family for last to be more specific of it. Now, verse 21 is the confusion.
Yeah.
It says, also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, and the older brother of Japheth, children were born. Now, there, in my translation, says he was the older brother of Japheth, and some of the translations say that. Literally what it says in the Hebrew is that Shem, brother of Japheth, elder. I mean, that's literally how the Hebrew reads. Shem, brother of Japheth, elder. So it means basically, if you translate it one way, which the New American Standard does, it says he's the older brother of Japheth. But if you read it literally, the way it says, he was Shem, the brother of Japheth, the elder.
That makes
And
more sense to me.
most of the modern translations agree with that Japheth was the elder, Shem was the middle one. And that's actually the most likely, and I believe, correct interpretation of the Hebrew. So again, some of you, depending on which version of the Bible you're reading, will say Shem's the oldest. Others will say Japheth's the oldest. I'm telling you, if you go back and look in the Hebrew, the most likely interpretation is Japheth was the oldest. Why is Shem usually listed first? We see it. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham's the youngest, but he's listed middle. Why? Because in the greater scheme of things, Ham is the one that had the most impact on the Israelites. Shem's listed first because he's the promised one. But in order of birth, it's believed it was Japheth, Shem, then Ham. And while the law, later on, the law usually gave preference to the oldest son, Jesus himself, the oldest son. How many times, throughout history did we see that God, decided to pick the younger of the two?
King David.
Yep, King David. He was the runt of the whole litter. Between Jacob and Esau. Esau was born first. In the descendants of Jacob himself, Judah was the third born. And his favorite son, Joseph, was the oldest son of Rachel, but he was like the next to youngest of all of them. So we see that there are plenty of exceptions to that rule. All right. Anyway, I'm not going to go through, again, list every single one of them because they're all, the whole rest of the chapter is this guy was the son of that one, who was the son of that one. But the bottom line is, just so you can visualize this, Shem's family, and I'm going to kind of draw circles since of his family all settled, they overlapped the families of Ham, were all in this area. So you had Japheth to the north, Ham to the south, Shem in the middle, and overlapping with that was Ham in the southern part and some with Japheth to the north. But the promised descendants were all concentrated in this area.
I know the Chinese claim to be descendants of Shem,
They did.
but the North Asians, the Mongolians, and the Japanese are descendants of Japheth. That's why they're so racially different.
Hard to say. All right, finish this chapter up. Verse 30 says, Now their settlement extended from Mesha as you go towards Sephar, the hill country of the east. Notice how many times in the Bible we have this constant reference to people moving eastward. And here's one of the reasons why, I think God told his, the early apostles and the missionaries in the first few generations of Christianity not to go in that direction, because when Adam and Eve rebelled and they were ran out of Eden, which direction did they go? East. When Noah got off the ark, which way did they go? East. Every time people are leaving the presence of God, they went east. But we see whenever Christ returns, he comes from the east, coming to the west. All right, now these are the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, according to their nations. These are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies, by their nations, and out of these nations were separated on the earth after the flood. They were separated on the earth after the flood. Now, when we get to this issue of Peleg, which it briefly mentions in this one, we're going to come back and save that one from when we talk about Babel, where it says that it was during Peleg, who was a descendant of Shem. It was during his days that the earth was divided. We'll go into more detail about that when we talk about the Tower of Babel on Wednesday. Questions this evening? All right.